A woman is found in the dirt. Not discovered, found. The way you find a thing that has been left there intentionally. 8 victims, 8 crime scenes. 1 killer, and no one can find him. But he left something behind. At nearly every crime scene, pressed into the blood and the mud and the pine floorboards, barefoot prints, walking, never running. A man completely at ease with what he had just done. And in every print of the right foot, a void. Where the smallest toe should be, nothing. Scar tissue. Absence. The Austin police chased that print for over a year. No match. No arrest. And then the killings simply stopped. 3 years later, a nearly identical signature begins appearing in the back alleys of London. The world names him Jack the Ripper. But here is the question that never got a real answer. Where was he before London? Most people who know this story know it as sort of a footnote to Jack the Ripper. I know that's how I always read it when I first discovered the story. Part of that reason is that in October of 1888, newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic were printing comparisons about the killer in Austin and could he be the same man that was now in Whitechapel. And so when I discovered this story, I did the same thing. I attached it to Jack the Ripper. But then I read about what the sheriff said in his testimony and what he said under oath. And that changes everything. Time now for the next chapter of Gaslight and Gallows, The Midnight Assassin. In February 1886, Austin police shot and killed a 19-year-old man named Nathan Elgin. Routine incident. The coroner filed his report. And inside that report, one line. Right foot, pinky toe, gone. The final hours of the year were supposed to be silent. A massive winter system had peppered Austin's rooftops with pellets of ice and was finally retreating, leaving the trees groaning under the weight of the freeze. The city was asleep. At the home of W.E. Hall, a house guest named Thomas Chalmers was jolted awake at 3 a.m. by a frantic pounding at the front door. The Halls were away on vacation. Chalmers was alone in the sprawling dark of the mansion on West Pecan Street. He rose. He felt his way through the black. The darkness was so complete he had to strike a match to see who was there. The tiny, trembling flare unveiled a nightmare. Standing in the threshold was Walter Spencer, the boyfriend of the household's cook, Mollie Smith. He was drenched in blood. His head had been split open by several deep wounds. Through the haze of a fractured skull, Walter pleaded,
"Mr. Tom, for God's sake, help me! Someone tried to kill me, and I can't find Mollie!"
He had tried to look for her. He couldn't see his own hand in the dark. Chalmers told the bleeding man to bandage his own wounds before he bled to death. He led Walter back out into the ice-slicked night. The mechanical finality of the deadbolt echoed through the empty hall. Then Thomas Chalmers mopped the floor and went back to sleep. Walter stumbled 2 doors down to the home of Dr. Ralph Steiner, who bandaged the shattered skull and waited for daylight. That morning, a man fetching firewood found what Walter couldn't see in the dark. The call came in soon after sunrise. A hello girl at the downtown telephone exchange patched through an urgent line from Ramey's grocery store.
Austin Police.
I have an urgent call from Ray V's grocery store.
It was Dr. Steiner, reporting a woman lying near the woodpile. Mollie Smith had been found. She had been dragged 50 steps into the alley and butchered. Her head was cleaved. Her body had been desecrated with a precision that no one in the Austin Police Department had seen before and would struggle for months to describe in clinical language. She was stiffening in the frost. The earth around her had turned the color of copper. As Austin prepared to ring in 1885, the shadow that had moved through that alley was already gone, back into a darkness that on this night had served him perfectly.
If you're enjoying this story, be sure to hit like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you always know when a new story is uploaded.
By early spring, City Marshal H. Grooms Lee hadn't produced a single answer to the blood on West Pecan Street. He commanded 12 men, a weary, underfunded force already being mocked in the local papers as slow and indifferent. Under pressure to deliver a villain, they looked for the most legible motive available. They found it at a saloon on East Pecan Street, where a man named William Lem Brooks worked the bar. Brooks and Mollie Smith had been sweethearts back in Waco. When she moved to Austin, he'd followed, and he'd been seen arguing with Walter Spencer. It was a Victorian triangle the law could understand: jealousy, heartbreak, a broken man. They dragged Brooks into a cell. But he'd been serving drinks at an all-night dance until 4 in the morning, never once leaving his post. In March, a grand jury quietly admitted the police had the wrong man. As the wildflowers bloomed across the Texas hill country, the Phantom put a violent end to the theory of a lover's quarrel. 2 Swedish girls, servants, Clara Strand and Christine Martinson, were hacked as they slept. They survived. Their sanity did not fully recover. One whispered of 2 men. One described a shadow that made no sound. The city chose to believe these were unrelated incidents. The dark was becoming a collective fever. Then, in the early hours of May 7th, the fever broke into a scream. Eliza Shelley was a cook on East Cypress Street. She was raising 3 young sons alone, while her husband Ike served the final months of a 6-year sentence at the Huntsville Penitentiary. He was due home in November. Eliza was already counting the days. She would never see him. On the night of May 6th, the assassin prioritized silence above everything. As Eliza and her children slept, he moved through the room and draped a heavy wool blanket over the boys' heads. A deliberate shroud, an act of coldness that separated this crime from a crime of passion. Then he turned to Eliza. The violence that followed was total. Her head was nearly cleaved in 2, while her 3 sons huddled beneath the wool, paralyzed by the sounds they were forbidden to see. The 8-year-old would later tell police that through the fabric, the world had simply gone black. He never saw the face of the thing that was destroying his world. The morning light revealed a room drowned in blood, and a trail. Barefoot prints, moving in a rhythmic, deliberate line, from the alley, across the threshold, and back into the night. The police followed them, measuring, crouching, pressing their fingers into the dried impressions on the pine floorboards. There was a void. A gap where the smallest toe should have pressed into the wood. The right foot, the pinky toe, gone. The Austin PD was desperate for answers. They immediately arrested a 19-year-old named Andrew Williams, whose big crime was walking barefoot near the crime scene. They compared the prints, and Andrew Williams' feet were not a match. They were different sizes. Plus, Andrew Williams had 5 toes on his right foot. The police were once again without any leads, while the killer stayed hiding in the shadows, watching, waiting for his next opportunity to strike. Two weeks later, Irene Cross was targeted near Schultz Beer Garden. The axe was replaced with a knife, used with such force that Irene appeared nearly decapitated. A child witness, Irene's nephew, described a chunky man in a ragged coat, his pant legs rolled up high, who stepped back into the dark before the matchlight could find his face. The barefoot prints were there again. Right foot forward, same void, same absence where the smallest toe should be. The city was no longer asking questions. It was loading weapons. August in Texas can feel like a leaden weight, a thick, airless heat that never lets up, that presses down on the city like a hand. In 1885, with blood running through the gutters of Austin, that heat had reached a different kind of boiling point. Clara Dick was attacked and left for dead in the shadows, barely surviving. The city grasped briefly at the idea that her attack was isolated, a domestic matter, a ghost from her past. That theory died on the night of August 30th. Rebecca Ramey was bludgeoned with an axe. She was the fortunate one, somehow surviving. Her 11-year-old daughter Mary was snatched from her bed and dragged into the suffocating silence of the backyard. What was done to her there did not just end a life. It changed the frequency of the fear in the city. Austin was no longer a boomtown, it was a slaughterhouse. On the night of September 28th, the servant quarters behind the Dunham home on Guadalupe became a site of primal carnage. The family cook, Gracie Vance, and her boyfriend, Orange Washington, were asleep. Orange never woke up. The axe guaranteed his final dream was his last. 2 house guests were bludgeoned with an axe, Lucinda Body and Patsy Gibson. Miraculously, they both survived. Gracie Vance was not so fortunate. She was struck with an axe and dragged from the cabin into the midnight air. The trail of blood led across the yard to the base of a weathered smokehouse. It was here where the forensic record shifted. The assassin set down the axe. He reached for a common brick, and he used it with a repetitive mechanical force, the kind of force that requires no skill, no precision, no anatomy. A force so sustained and so mindless that by the time he was done, Gracie Vance was unrecognizable to the world. The investigators stood over the body beside the smokehouse and found it again. The trail of barefoot prints leading away into the tall grass. And within the prints, pressed cleanly into the blood-soaked earth, the same chilling absence. The missing toe. After 9 months, the Austin police had no suspect, conflicting descriptions, and a body count making headlines in London and New York. The world was watching, and the authorities, drowning under the weight of their own failure, reached for the only thing left, a sacrifice. By November, Austin was on the verge of a total nervous breakdown. Under the crushing weight of public fury, the police reached back to the very first drop of blood, the ice storm on West Pecan Street. Nearly a year after the murder of Mollie Smith, they arrested Walter Spencer, the man who had been struck first by the midnight assassin, the man who had stumbled through the dark, unable to find his own girlfriend's body. They couldn't catch the phantom in the streets, so they prosecuted the man who had survived its first strike. In December, while the real killer moved through the winter cold, Walter Spencer stood trial. 2 days, an acquittal. He walked out a free man, and the city had nothing. No killer, no momentum, and a flank left wide open. On Christmas Eve, the assassin walked through it. For his final act, he moved out of the servant quarters and into the parlors. In a single horrific hour, he crossed the city and struck two of Austin's socialites, Susan Hancock and Eula Phillips, women whose wealth and social position had seemed, until that night, like a form of armor. The armor was meaningless. Susan Hancock was dragged from her bed into the freezing backyard, the same rhythmic axe blows. She would linger for 4 agonizing days before dying on December 28th. Less than a mile away, the scene inside the Phillips house was something the officers who entered it would spend the rest of their lives struggling to describe. Eula Phillips was found dead in the backyard. Inside the house, her husband James lay unconscious in the bed, his skull fractured by an axe. He would survive. Beside him, untouched by the blade, sat the couple's young son. In the silence of that room, on Christmas morning, the child was still holding an apple. The Christmas sun rose on a city that had finally broken. Vigilante mobs filled the streets. The city declared war on a phantom it could not describe, could not find, and could not stop. In early 1886, still desperate for a conviction, the city arrested Jimmy Phillips for the murder of his wife Eula. Despite his own life-threatening injuries, he was forced into a courtroom in June and sentenced to 7 years. The conviction was eventually overturned for lack of evidence. What the law had ignored, again, was sitting on the Phillips' front porch. Pressed into the wood in a pool of drying blood, a single barefoot print. Right foot, missing its pinky toe. The evidence had been there the entire time. Multiple crime scenes, multiple investigators, and no one had been able to follow the print to its source. And then, in early 1886, the killings stopped. The midnight assassin evaporated. Constable John Neal was patrolling the desolate, soot-dark stretch of Buck's Row when 2 men approached him. They had found a woman in a gateway, passed out, they thought. Just another gin-drunk soul sleeping off the night in the Whitechapel mist. Neal approached the dark shape in the shadows. He reached for his belt and shuttered back the lens of his bullseye lantern. A narrow, blinding beam of white light cut the fog. It moved slowly, up the hem of a tattered skirt, past a pair of cold, white hands, and then it reached the throat. Mary Ann Nichols had been opened up with a clinical, surgical precision, the kind of precision that implied knowledge, that implied practice. The Midnight Assassin was gone from Texas, but the work, the signature, had just introduced itself to the world under a new name. While Austin consumed itself with the Phillips trial, while the newspapers printed their verdicts and the law congratulated itself on finding a villain, a different kind of disturbance erupted at Dick Rogers' saloon on East Pecan Street. A 19-year-old man was drunk and violent. He had attacked a woman named Julia. He had beaten her, kicked her, and then, as if by instinct, he began dragging her toward the darkness of a nearby building. When the police arrived, he didn't stop. He brandished a knife. Officer John Bracken fired once into the dark. The bullet found his spine. By morning, he was dead. His name was Nathan Elgin. His body went to the coroner. Routine examination. the kind of paperwork that history swallows whole. But someone in Austin was paying attention. Sheriff Malcolm Hornsby ordered a plaster cast made of Nathan Elgin's foot. Not a sketch, not a written description, a cast. A physical three-dimensional mold of a dead man's foot. And when Hornsby took the cast and held it against the bloody track, the correspondence was exact. Right foot, one toe missing. Hornsby testified to all of this under oath, on the record. He also testified to something else. Since the death of Nathan Elgin, since the night Officer Bracken fired that single shot into the dark, there had been no more mysterious murders in the city. Not one. So the bloody footprints now had a match. Nathan Elgin, who lay dead on the coroner's table. Now, was Nathan the midnight assassin? Hard to say, but he lived and he worked within walking distance of every crime scene. He was also well known to have a short fuse and very violent toward women. The timeline is curious, since the murder stopped right after his death, and of course, he was missing the pinky toe on his right foot. Now, what it doesn't tell us is if the midnight assassin is also Jack the Ripper. But most experts today now believe there's no connection between the two men. But this story doesn't end on a coroner's slab, and it doesn't end in the foggy alleyways of London. It ends in the streets of Austin. Because in 1894, a decade after the first body, Mollie Smith, was found in the alley, the city of Austin made a decision. They purchased 31 Moonlight towers, 165 feet of iron, each one crowned with a cluster of arc lights powerful enough to flood an entire city block. They planted them across Austin like iron sentinels overlooking the city. Austin never officially connected the towers to the midnight assassin, but this was a city that had spent a year being hunted in the dark, a city that had learned what absolute darkness was capable of. Today, 17 towers still remain in Austin. It's just a fascinating story. Now, a couple more interesting tidbits about this tale. I actually did some math, and I crunched some numbers and took the average time between each attack, between each killing. And now sometimes it was 90 or more days, and sometimes it was a couple days. But if you take every single attack in the Midnight Assassin, starting December 30th, 1884, all the way through to when the killing stopped, the average time between each attack was 47 days. I did some more math. Nathan Elgin was killed February 9th, 1886, while he was dragging a woman he had just attacked towards a dark house. The number of days from when he was attacking that woman to the previous attack on Christmas Eve? 47 days. Now, I read a variety of articles and websites as I was researching this story, and through that research, I came across a book actually called The Midnight Assassin, and it's written by a man named Skip Hollandsworth. And I have to tell you, I bought this book, and I'm about 8 chapters in, and I'm at the point of the Eliza Shelley murder, which is really more awful than I ever knew through my research. I mean, here was a woman and her 3 children were covered in this wool blanket as she was just butchered, and the kids were just there all night. In fact, the kids weren't even discovered until the next morning. They had just been under the blanket the entire time. Skip Hollandsworth in this book did just a phenomenal job. So I highly recommend that you buy the book. I also recommend that you hit like, subscribe, and share, and that you comment below, because The Midnight Assassin truly is a fascinating story, and we'd love to hear what your take is on it. And also, we've got some great stories planned for this series, so we invite you to join us for the ride. Well, that's going to do it for this chapter. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Grant Kaufman, and we'll see you on the next chapter of Gaslight and Gallows, Historical True Crime.